James Christopher Owsley, better known as Christopher Prius, stands as one of the most prolific and influential writers to ever shape the comic book medium. He's the man who transformed Black Panther from a boring Tarzan knockoff into the most iconic black hero in fiction. A reinvention that would ultimately help carry the hero all the way to the big screen, where he became a billion-dollar cultural phenomenon. His Batman comics inspired Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins. He wrote what many still held was the definitive Deathstroke run. He broke the color barrier in comics, becoming Marvel's first black editor and writer. Christopher Prius didn't just contribute to comics, he changed them. But there's also another story that the comic industry never tells. A story of how one of comics' most brilliant minds was quietly blacklisted and pushed out of the very field he innovated. How he went from writing Green Lantern and Spider-Man to driving a bus just to survive. They didn't tell you how he helped co-create many of Milestone's most iconic heroes such as Static and Icon, but received zero credit or compensation for his work, neither from DC or Milestone. This is the rise, fall, and resurrection of Christopher Prius, and strangely enough, it all began with a typewriter. James Owsley, who the world would later know as Christopher Prius, was born in Queens, New York on June 30th, 1961. From the very beginning, comics were everywhere in his life. Back then, you could find him on drugstore racks, gas stations, newsstands, every corner of the city. And young James grabbed every Spider-Man, Batman, and Superman book he could find, usually for just 15 cents. When he was 10, he asked his mother for a typewriter. He used it to write superhero fan fiction and his own science fiction stories. He typed so much he actually broke that typewriter and two others in his family. But even with all of that writing, James didn't dream of being a comic book writer. He wanted to be the guy who hired the writer, the editor. He didn't even know what an editor was yet, but he knew that's what he wanted. In 1976, when Owsley was 15 years old, he enrolled at the New York School of Media Arts. He was an average student, more interested in music, art, and of course comics. During his senior year, he would join the city's executive high school internship program. His mother wanted him to be a lawyer, so he applied to 3 law firms and then 1 internship at Marvel Comics. He skipped every law firm appointment, but on June 6, 1978, he walked into Marvel with a comic he had written and drawn himself. He beat out 3 other candidates and earned an internship, and from that moment, his life would change. James was handpicked by Marvel's editor-in-chief, Jim Shooter, who became something of a father figure to him. Around the office, people joked and called him Little Shooter. He started out doing what any 18-year-old intern would, fetching coffee, running errands, but he climbed fast. Very fast. By 1983, he was an assistant editor under Larry Hama on Conan the Barbarian. That same year, he sold his first professional script, a Falcon one-shot. The first issue was drawn by Paul Smith, whose artwork the office immediately fell in love with. The problem was, almost nobody actually read the script, so Smith's art took off, but Owsley remained unnoticed, at least to everyone except Jim Shooter. Shooter would commission 3 more issues from Owsley, turning this project into a limited series, and he would pair Owsley with young artist Mark Bright. The two became close friends, and they would collaborate many times in the years to come. And then in 1984, at just 24 years old, James Owsley was promoted to full editor of Marvel Comics. This made him not only the youngest editor in Marvel history, but also the first black editor at any major American comics publisher. And one of his first big responsibilities was Spider-Man, a book most editors avoided because of the stress, the deadlines, and the pressure. Jim Shooter went to Denny O'Neil, who was editing Power Man and Iron Fist at the time, and told him that James Owsley would be the new writer of the series. This immediately made Denny and James get off on the wrong foot, because Denny already didn't want Owsley on the book. So now that he was essentially being forced by Jim Shooter to work with him, there was definitely some animosity, but eventually O'Neil would come to like James. Mark Bright would team up with Owsley again on the series, and their Power Man and Iron Fist run is still a cult classic today. Something to note too is that James Owsley had started going by Jim Owsley. Why? Well, in his words, because everyone else was doing it. There were like 15 different Jims working at Marvel Comics. Power Man and Iron Fist wasn't afraid to lean into social issues. We saw Luke Cage written as more intelligent with a more proper vocabulary rather than the loud, rambunctious brute he was presented as before. However, this change oddly made some employees upset with Owsley. These white employees accused Owsley of not being a real black person because none of his black characters he wrote sounded black, whatever that means. Owsley would write the series from issue 100 111 to 125, where it ended with Iron Fist being brutally killed. This made fans very angry, but it wasn't actually Owsley's idea. It was editor Denny O'Neil who ordered Owsley to kill Iron Fist out of spite. And the reason why is because Denny liked the book and he enjoyed working with Owsley and Bright. But the company didn't want to continue Power Man and Iron Fist anymore, despite it being a critical and financial success. So O'Neil decided that if they couldn't do it, no one could, which is petty as hell, but I respect it. Larry Hama would then offer Jim Owsley Conan the Barbarian, where he would write 41 issues in a widely loved run. And then in 1986, Jim Owsley and Mark Bright collaborated on the Spider-Man vs. Wolverine one-shot, which was a huge hit and is still considered a cult classic today. However, none of these, despite being beloved by fans, would ever launch Jim Owsley into stardom. When looking back at his time at Marvel, he once shared this story.
Some staffer, whose name I won't mention, some staffer came by my office, saw all these black people in the office, went to go see Shooter, and he's like, they're having a meeting, you know? So Shooter pops up in my office, and he's really embarrassed. Look, I hate to ask you this question. There's a rumor going around that you're firing all the white, talent and replacing them with black talent. And I thought, well, this is just the most insane thing. The answer in my head said, don't feed this. He's embarrassed enough by being here. Jim and I were very close. In fact, they used to call me Little Shooter because, I was like his protege. So I just looked at him and I said very softly, no, Jim, I'm not firing all the white people, firing black people, And I said, well, the reason why there were so many black people in my office that day was that the checks were late. Number one. And number two is that the reason why they were in my office is that they feel welcome in my office.
Right.
And maybe that's a question you should ask, some of your other editors rather than pick on me about it. It just kind of exposed, well, I'm just wondering, are people like really huddling around the office and they're afraid to talk to me about these things? Really? Because I never considered Marvel to be a particularly, racist place.
Right.
But then again, I really wasn't looking. Sometimes you have to look for it,
Despite the sometimes overt racism Jim Owsley would face from certain staff members at Marvel during the 80s, he would later look back at these moments as the good old days. Because what he was about to face after following Denny O'Neil to DC, dropping his exclusive contract with Marvel in 1988 to write under O'Neil, would ultimately lead him to being placed on a permanent blacklist from the comics industry, one that would eventually force him out for good. At DC, he did a 12-issue maxi series called The Unknown Soldier, and in 1988, Denny O'Neil assigned him to Action Comics Weekly, which was a 48-page anthology released every week, containing multiple 8-page stories about different characters. Jim Owsley and Mark Bright worked on the Green Lantern 8-pages in these books, which became infamous for the killing of Jon Stewart's lover, Kat Matui, something fans absolutely hated Owsley for, though he says it was completely Denny O'Neil's decision. Owsley would write 22 issues of Action Comics Weekly. Then he and Mark Bright would collaborate again on a new Green Lantern series titled Emerald Dawn, which retold the origin of Hal Jordan. But this book would be in development limbo for over a year, the editors constantly arguing over creative differences. Denny O'Neil and Jim Owsley wanted to do a more grounded take on the character, very reminiscent to the Green Lantern and Green Arrow series that Denny O'Neil wrote in the past, but other people wanted it to be more fantastical. Owsley allegedly rewrote issue 1 12 times before quitting the series entirely after it hit print. After Emerald Dawn, Owsley was fed up with comics and quit the industry altogether, opting to drive a city bus in New Jersey. In 1990, Mike Gold offered Owsley an editorial position at DC, which he declined at first, but after persistent offers and Owsley being kind of desperate from being recently married and needing to provide for his wife, Owsley accepted on the condition that the editorial job would pay more than driving a bus. He was told yes, but this turned out to be a lie. So by June of 1990, Jim Owsley was at DC editing books like The Raid, The Question, and Arion the Immortal during the day, and at night he would be driving the bus. It would be around this time also that he would change his name from James Owsley to what we all know him as now, Christopher Priest. Speaking of Priest, he was also preaching as well. Yeah, Christopher Priest was a preacher. Having 3 jobs and a recent marriage was already a lot on his plate, but things were about to get even fuller when DC Comics artist Dennis Cowan approached him to be a part of a team of black creators developing a new line of comics with black characters. And little did he know this would be the beginning of the end of his career. Priest would join Dwayne McDuffie, Michael Davis, and Derek T. Dingle in developing what would later later become Milestone Media. And when he was asked about how much fun he had creating such iconic and beloved characters, he said this.
Oh, it was never fun. There was there was no fun to be had.
And to be honest, when you know the context, it makes sense how he would answer that way.
It was straining on relationships, straining on marriages. I'm pretty sure that it torpedoed my marriage. I think it was hard for some spouses to believe that we were spending 18, 19 hours, on these projects.
Developing what are now iconic characters like Static, Icon, Rocket, Hardware, and the Blood Syndicate. And they were super broke, like literally they would have meetings inside of McDonald's. Priest had a huge impact on Milestone. He literally set the groundwork for Dakota co-creating all of the core characters, especially Icon, who Priest says he spent the most time on, and that really was his baby. He gave Virgil Hawkins his iconic superhero name, Static. He wrote the Milestone Universe Bible. Christopher Priest was a vital member of Milestone Media, and he was supposed to be the editor-in-chief when it got launched. But after about a year of putting thousands of hours into the company, Priest left for personal reasons. Now, he's never directly explained what those personal reasons were, but there seemed to be some kind of infighting or disagreements about how to run the business. Now, although Christopher Priest would step away before Milestone was fully formed, he would still obviously be credited as a contributor and co-creator of these characters, right? Well, the answer would be no, because Milestone didn't acknowledge any of Priest's contributions for a long time. He was never, and still isn't to this day, credited as co-creator of any of the characters he helped build. The most public credit he got was in 2000, well after Milestone had ended, where Dwayne McDuffie published an article highlighting Priest's contributions to the company and the characters. But still, Priest never received any royalties or any official credits from the company. And while he certainly doesn't have any beef or any drama with the men behind Milestone, I mean, he literally described them as his brothers, the whole experience still seems to have left a bitter taste in his mouth, even today. Priest was asked if he'd be interested in returning to write a new series for the characters, and he gave an interesting answer.
I think there's still kind of unresolved issues. I'm happy to consult and talk to them, on occasion. But I think until certain issues are resolved, for me to actually be in the mix with them, then contracts have to be signed, and then it gets complicated because of we still have not actually put out all those fires yet. It's a little John Scully, Steve Jobs. There's a little of that going on. Yeah. If you, just to give you an idea.
But even despite all of the drama surrounding Milestone, none of it would compare to what happened to Christopher Priest during the creation of Xero. But first, we have to get to the sponsor of this video, Eden Comics. My friend Justin Eden has been drawing and writing comics since he was like 6 years old. And he's working on a bunch of cool comics right now that you'll probably be interested in. He made Doomsdays, which is this creepy apocalypse story set in 1970s England. Or Epica, which is a huge multiverse comic with different universes that all play by their own rules. Or you have Super Show, which this one I think is the coolest. It's like an Adult Swim style comic where a deranged TV host show interviews characters from fiction. If you want to see something built from the ground up, and if you're into weird, ambitious webtoons, Eden Comics is definitely worth checking out. All of his links will be in the description. Please go check him out. Let's get back into the video. Shortly after leaving Milestone in 1993, Priest would drop his position as an in-house editor at DC in an attempt to save his failing marriage. And so he would return to writing comics because apparently comic writers got paid more money and had to spend less hours than editors. And this is how we would see him write series like DeRay and Justice League Task Force in 1994. Around this same time period, DC was openly looking for something new and edgy, something to push the envelope and think outside the box. And that's when Priest pitched his concept of Xero. Priest first came up with the idea when he was just a teenager, the concept of a black special ops agent who essentially wears whiteface. After spending nearly 2 years in limbo, the series was finally greenlit in 1997. Blood Syndicate artist Chris Cross would team up with Priest to bring the idea to life at DC Comics. Xero is about an African-American man named Coltrane Walker, who by day is a professional basketball player, but by night is a special ops agent who kills people for the US government, operating in whiteface as Xero. Now, the book was never meant to be slapstick comedy like White Chicks or a Drewski skit. It's a serious story about a black man who lost lost his black identity. A black man who didn't even care about his own people. He wouldn't even sign little kids basketballs who would ask for him. He witnessed a black waitress get brutally beat up and killed by a white man, and he could have stopped it, but that wasn't a part of the mission. And this would haunt him. He'd literally have dreams about it. Another one of his missions was to kill a black man who was on the airplane. It was easy to pick his target because there's only one black man in first class on the plane. But after Xero did the mission and he killed him, he realized, he was like, wow, there was only one black man on that plane and I killed him. And then he looked down at his white face. It's a really great story about identity and him coming to terms with his own blackness. But according to Christopher Priest, 1 month before Xero issue 1 even shipped, a higher up at DC told him that Xero was the worst comic he had ever seen. Now Priest was obviously shocked by this response, and he suggested just canceling the book altogether so that he could shop it to other publishers like Image or Wildstorm, but he was told no. Since DC already had solicited Xero, it had to be released. But DC would put little to no effort into actually marketing the book because, like most comics centered around black characters, the company viewed them as black books, meaning they deserved little attention or resources. And the reason publishers felt this way was because the belief then and now was that black characters didn't sell well, and they don't. Xero was spat on by the higher ups. Prius was promised that Xero would be printed on a higher quality graded paper, which was literally in the contract, but it never happened. They gave it the cheapest, worst quality possible. Prius also wanted more light-skinned black people in the comic, but editors refused, claiming that light-skinned black people didn't look black enough. What almost no one knows is that Prius once had a conversation with one of these higher ups about doing a Batman and Xero crossover. The book would be a one-shot and it would be released before Xero just so more people would get eyes on the character since he was fighting Batman. And the person agreed, and so then Prius spoke to the Batman editor at the time, who also agreed to help push the book. So Prius then scripted the entire issue for the crossover, and he sent in a proposal, but he didn't get a response for 2 weeks, so he tried to follow up to see where the status was on it with his editor. But when he did, the editor screamed at Prius for 2 hours, calling him names and accused him of trying to force the company to publish the crossover. He then went to the Batman editor and told them to disregard Prius's pitch and apologize for what he called his stupidity. An editor's job is to read the comics they oversee in order to provide feedback and make corrections, but none of the editors working on Xero actually read it. That's why there are still serious mistakes in the book, like George Bush's tie appears then disappears through panels. And there are entire pages where the dialogue wasn't pasted correctly. To this day, he still describes this as the worst working experience he's ever had in the industry. At this point, Christopher Priest was effectively blacklisted from the comic book industry, but in a very unique usage of the term. He wasn't just blacklisted in the traditional sense, he was quite literally put on a blacklist. He was only allowed to work on black characters and nothing else. And if he refused, he would simply have to go back to driving a bus. And often that's exactly what he did. In 1997, Priest would go on to work on Steel for 18 issues with Denys Cowan. Because the book had a black lead, none of the editors were actually reading it, similar to what happened with Xero, but this time it worked in Priest's favor because he was essentially able to do whatever he wanted because no one was reading it. He made Steel far cooler and far more powerful than he had ever been characterized before. Denys Cowan's design for the character was beautiful and intense, and Steel was basically a Superman parody as Priest himself describes it, and it was awesome, but DC never reprinted any of it in a collected edition and still hasn't to this day. Around this time, Prius also co-created Quantum and Woody with longtime collaborator Mark Bright for Acclaimed Comics. The series would go on to become a cult classic, and this is where Prius fully developed his now iconic non-linear storytelling, complete with the black box title cards he's now known for. This storytelling approach would become the cornerstone for his Black Panther run the following year. In 1998, Prius was asked by Joe Quesada to join Marvel's new Marvel Knights imprint. Prius assumed that this meant he'd be writing Daredevil, but Quesada instead wanted him to do Black Panther.
When he said Black Panther, I was like, who? I was so focused on Daredevil that it took me a while to hear him when he said Black Panther. And I had no interest in writing Black Panther. Black Panther?
Prius was understandably disappointed, but he agreed to do it only if he could do whatever he wanted with the book with full creative freedom, and Quesada agreed. Prius originally wrote issue 1 in a standard linear format, but Quesada suggested he lean into the non-linear Quantum and Woody style instead. So Prius rewrote the issue, and that decision made the book stand out immediately. When working on Black Panther, Prius said he wanted the character to be powerful and capable. He was tired of seeing the king of the most advanced nation nation on Earth getting beat up by random street level thugs. He and Quesada even pulled inspiration for the first arc from Eddie Murphy's Coming to America, a story about an African prince traveling to America in search of a wife. Prius has described how the book struggled heavily with sales and faced constant editorial interference, meant to make it more accessible to a broader audience. Despite that, the series still developed a cult following. The few people who were reading it loved it, and today it's widely regarded as one of the best comic runs of the 2000s. The book had humor, action, and deep emotional weight. Every issue felt like it mattered. Despite being titled Black Panther, the series was really an Everett Ross book featuring Black Panther. Ross functioned as an unreliable narrator, the white male lead designed to reflect and deconstruct the contemporary sensibilities of many white comic readers approaching a story about an African king. Or in simple terms, most white comic book fans were racist, so they needed a racist white male character that they can identify with so that they could actually read a black character book. That's why Ross begins the series as an overtly racist comedic character, but over time he learns, grows, and changes. He comes to accept black people more fully. He develops a genuine friendship with T'Challa, and even becomes the king of Wakanda in Black Panther for a brief period. Near the end of Prius's run, Marvel pushed for a new direction to chase higher sales. Editorial was tired of the dense socio-political commentary and non-linear structure, and they were done with T'Challa. They pitched an all-new American hip-hop Black Panther, who would eventually become Casper Cole. Prius didn't want to do the book at all, but editorial told him that if he didn't, they'd just pay someone else to do it, so he agreed because bills still had to be paid. Dan Fraga, who was originally stated to be the artist, quit after just one issue and was replaced by Jorge Lucas, whose style didn't really fit the tone of the series. The series was ultimately canceled at issue 62 in July of 2003, and it remains the longest continuous Black Panther run to this day. After Black Panther ended, Prius pitched a new series titled The Crew, which would be canceled before the first issue even shipped. The Crew centered on black superheroes teaming up to fight crime in a gritty urban environment. Casper Cole returned as the White Tiger, War Machine was featured, and Josiah X was further developed. It was a great series with great characters, but once again, Marvel executives saw it as just another black book, unworthy of marketing, unworthy of effort. But Prius was very aware of these realities. Prius knew The Crew wouldn't sell in traditional comic book shops, which were and still are largely white owned and white patronized. Prius didn't want the book to be distributed through Diamond Distributions and lumped into regular white comic shops where it was destined to fail. Instead, he wanted the comic to be in barbershops, bodegas, and beauty salons, where actual people of color would be able to see it and buy it. He suggested Spanish language editions for Latino communities. He wanted hip-hop CDs packaged with the collected editions, but editorial didn't care. They lumped the book with the regular straight white male audiences where, like always, they didn't buy it. And the book was inevitably canceled before it even released, and Prius was ready to quit comics entirely. Because this time he was genuinely proud of The Crew. He finally had the perfect artist in Joe Bennett, characters he deeply believed in, but none of it mattered. The Crew was going to be the final book that Prius had ever wrote because he had quit. Except shortly afterward, he received a call from editor Tom Brevoort asking if he'd be interested in writing Captain America and the Falcon. Prius almost said no. He was burned out and disillusioned with an industry that had clearly rejected him. But this was Captain America, an A-tier character. Prius usually got C or D tier assignments. This was his chance to prove that he could handle the biggest icons, so he accepted. He originally struggled with how to write Captain America because how do you challenge a symbol of moral perfection without dismantling him and giving another dark, subversive deconstruction that we've seen so much today? His solution to this problem was Falcon. Sam Wilson would make questionable decisions behind Steve's back, decisions that might ultimately implicate Steve himself. How does Steve deal with that? How does he handle his best friend doing some shady stuff? The premise was strong, but fans didn't respond well to Bart Sears' art. The characters were overly bulky, the panel layouts confusing, and the visuals clashed with Prius's vision. Prius himself wasn't fond of the art either, but after 4 issues, Sears left and was replaced by Joe Bennett. Just like on The Crew, Prius loved Bennett's work, and their collaborations reignited his creative drive. While the book wasn't losing money, it also wasn't profitable enough to justify continuing, especially with Ed Brubaker's critically acclaimed Captain America series running concurrently. This is when Tom Brevoort suggested removing Captain America and relaunching the book as The Falcon. Prius would later say that if Falcon was a white character, he probably would have accepted, but he was exhausted from only being trusted with black characters. And retitling the series as Falcon felt like a demotion, so he declined, and the series would end with issue 14 in May 2005.
And it just felt like a punch in the face. Over the years, I had gone from being a writer who was writing Spider-Man, who had relaunched Green Lantern, who wrote Power Man, Iron Fist, and obviously Quantum Woody and this litany of stuff. And somehow I had stopped being a writer and I had become a black writer.
And to add insult to injury, just 1 month later, on June 15, 2005, Batman Begins would release in theaters, becoming a massive blockbuster hit, loved by both critics and fans. But the sad part is that Christopher Priest was the one who wrote the comics that inspired the film. Back in 1989, Priest wrote 2 issues of Batman, being 431 and 432, that explored the early years of Bruce Wayne learning to become a ninja. And this was loosely adapted in Nolan's Batman film. The intro to the movie of Bruce climbing the mountain and walking through the door was directly adapted panel for panel from Priest, but Priest received zero compensation from the movie, not a dime of royalties, not even a special thanks in the credits. And this would be the year that Christopher Priest would retire from the comic industry altogether. He was done. As I said earlier, he was on a blacklist. Every year or so, DC or Marvel would come to him to write some black character like Deadlock or Black Lightning, and he would always say no. They once offered him Firestorm, and he said yes, assuming that Firestorm was still the white kid Ronnie Raymond, but once he realized that they wanted to write the new black incarnation of him in Jason Rouge, he promptly declined. Many people misinterpret this as Priest hating himself or his race, or not wanting to write black characters, but this couldn't be further from the truth. He wanted to write black characters, he just didn't want to be a black writer, and that's what he was to the comic industry. Priest retired from the comic industry, and he had picked up a day job, stocking shelves at Walmart, and when he wasn't doing that, he was riding his bike. He wrote a blog in 2011 titled Bus Boy, which probably might be the most deep and introspective passage he ever wrote. He talked about depression and loneliness and happiness and what it all means. He talked about how he always did things on other people's terms, how he never truly felt like he could do what he wanted to do. And Christopher Priest missed working in comics, but the industry didn't miss him. No one wanted to work with Priest. He thought he was an outcast and that he would never work again, but he could not have been more wrong. In October of 2014, Valiant Comics would bring back Quantum and Woody for a 5-issue miniseries, reuniting the creators Christopher Priest and Mark Bright. This marking Christopher Priest's first big return to comics after 10 years of not working. The series was great, and Priest had a lot of fun doing it, reuniting with his longtime collaborator and best friend. Now, although the series was great, it led to no new Big 2 work. But then came 2016, when DC was preparing to wrap up their New 52 initiative to usher in the future of the DC Universe, DC Rebirth. DC asked Priest if he wanted to write Cyborg, which he promptly declined because he was black. But then 2 weeks later, editor Maury Javins called Christopher Priest to see if he wanted to do Deathstroke, and he asked to clarify, "Y'all aren't trying to race swap Deathstroke, right? Am I writing the real Slade Wilson?" And she said yes. And that's when the series got into development. Carlo Pegulane would be the main artist of the book with beautiful realism. And to put it simply, Deathstroke was a hit. Priest brought the character back to his villain roots from Marv Wolfman and George Perez's Teen Titans run. He fleshed out so many great characters like Jericho, Rose, Dr. Icon, and most importantly, Slade. He had the non-linear storytelling, which worked a lot, and he brought back the now iconic black title cards that he became known for. Priest is back, the media would say, but his response was often, "I never left, y'all left me." The series would last 50 issues, being praised by critics and fans alike. And it also ended because Priest wanted it to end. It wasn't canceled like many of his past books were. But it wasn't over yet for Priest, because in January of 2017, Ryan Coogler would start filming his Black Panther movie, a character virtually no one knew or cared about. But in 2018, the movie would go on to be a cultural phenomenon, netting over $1.3 billion in the box office. Millions of black kids and black families finally had a superhero they can look up to that looked like them on a big screen. And the movie was enjoyable to everyone of all races and cultures. It was Christopher Priest who created a lot of the core characters who were loved in this movie, like Okoye, Everett Ross, Nakia. Unfortunately, he didn't receive any royalties because the comic industry loves and cares about their creators. However, he was featured in the special thanks in the credits. And he, along with a bunch of other Black Panther writers, were invited to a roundtable discussion with director Ryan Coogler where they talked about the character. And the movie being such a smash hit attracted a lot of people to the work of Christopher Priest, since he largely was credited for revitalizing the character. All of a sudden, he was being bombarded at conventions, hundreds of people asking for his autographs, whereas before he was largely ignored. He was being brought in for interviews, people knew his name, and he even was on a set of Avengers Infinity War where he met Black Panther actor Chadwick Boseman, who who was actually a fan of Prius. He even had some great conversations with Kevin Feige on the set. This same year in 2018, Prius would write Justice League, though it was only for 9 issues. This is something that just a decade prior, Prius would never have even dreamed of. In 2019, he'd also be given Dynamite's Vampirella, a very deep and emotional series despite its very lewd covers. A series he is also still writing to this day. I think this marks like the longest series he's ever written. In 2020, he'd write a US Agent miniseries in conjunction with Marvel's Falcon and the Winter Soldier. However, the biggest announcement in his career would occur in 2022, where hip-hop legend 50 Cent announced he would be teaming up with Christopher Prius to make a film adaptation of Xero. Prius regained the rights to Xero in 2016 after DC did virtually nothing with the character for 2 entire decades, and now he's going to the big screen, and Prius is a consultant for the movie and will receive royalties for his creations. And that is a huge FU to that comic editor who told him that it was one of the worst comics he had ever read. This same year, he would write his Black Adam series with Rafa Sandoval. The book was praised by fans and critics, but ultimately it was cut short at 12 issues. And that's because it was largely overshadowed by Dwayne Johnson's Black Adam movie, which Prius believes the failure of the film may have contributed to the book's demise. Many people think Prius may just be cursed because this same year he launched his brand new creator-owned series for heavy metal called Entropy, with Montos as the artist, and the book was canceled after 1 issue due to heavy metal basically collapsing. The entire miniseries is completely finished from the writing to the art, but they're just sitting in limbo, making this the second time in Christopher Prius's career where his own creator-owned book would only be 1 issue due to the rest being canceled due to the company failing. The first being Concrete Jungle back in 1998. 2023 would be sort of a bounce back though, as Christopher Prius would write his Superman Lost maxi series about Superman being missing from Earth for a few hours, but for him it had been 20 years. Teaming up again with artist Carlo Pagulayan from Deathstroke. The series was excellent, praised by critics and fans, and actually got nominated in the 2024 Eisners for Best Limited Series. Also important to note that Superman Lost is the first Superman series in its 87 years of existence to be written by a black man. Now you'd think after being nominated for an Eisner, which we've seen skyrocket the popularity of many other writers in comics, that Prius would notice a pretty substantial change in his career in terms of getting new work from the big two. But he'd come to find out not much would change. He still was looked at as just another guy. Neither DC or Marvel has gotten him to write any A-list or even B-list heroes like Batman or Superman, or not even Flash or Iron Man, both of which he's submitted pitches for. Maybe Christopher Prius's creative style was simply too complex, too intelligent, too non-linear. But that wouldn't make very much sense because current Wonder Woman writer Tom King has built a very successful career at DC doing the same exact style, which even he has admitted that part of his creative process was inspired by Prius. Tom King has written Batman, Wonder Woman, Supergirl, and his work is even being used as inspiration for James Gunn's newly launched DCU. But maybe it's just his age. Christopher Prius is 64 years old at this point. Maybe DC just wants younger, fresher voices to be pushing these characters forward. But that also wouldn't make sense because 63-year-old Mark Waid has had no struggle maintaining a career at DC Comics. He's been pushed more than ever. He's doing Batman and Superman World's Finest. He wrote Absolute Power. He's now doing Justice League Unlimited. So if it isn't his writing style up for question and it isn't his age, what is it? Could it be his personality? Maybe people just find Prius annoying or too outspoken, or they don't like his humor or his politics. That would be hard to believe considering they've had no issue hiring far more controversial and, quite frankly, evil figures to do high-profile characters. Or could it possibly be racism? That's often the elephant in the room that many people ignore. Both DC and Marvel have been known to only pander to minorities when it's convenient for them, but leaving them in the dust in times where it really matters. So there really are no easy answers as to why Christopher Prius hasn't been given the proper respect and admiration that he deserves from the comic industry. But if I'm being quite honest, I really doubt the guy even cares. Prius has solidified his name and legacy in the comic book Hall of Fame. He never gave up on comics, even when comics gave up on him. He is loved and held by thousands of fans as a comic book legend, even though he hates that word. Black kids wouldn't have been able to watch Static Shock or Black Panther if it wasn't for Christopher James Prius. None of us would have been able to watch the legendary Batman Begins if it wasn't for Christopher James Prius. And no matter how much the comic industry hates him, Christopher James Prius will always be one of the greatest comic book writers of all time.